Hello, dear friends, and welcome. Tell me, where are you tonight? And what time is it where you are? Wherever you may be, let this story carry you gently through time and memory. Tonight, we enter a world of legend. The night lay thick over Tenochtitlán, a living city of stone and water, its heart beating with the rhythm of drums and fire. Lake Texcoco held the reflection of 1,000 flames, each torch a trembling star scattered upon the rippling surface. Canoes drifted silently through the canals, their paddles slicing water with a sound that was more like breath than movement. From the great temples, incense curled into the sky, carrying the scent of copal and burning sage, while voices rose in chants that echoed across the valley. The city never slept fully. Even in the stillness, life stirred. Merchants sorted goods for the morning market. Women wove by lamplight. Guards patrolled with obsidian blades at their sides. But beneath the everyday murmur, something else lived in the night. A sound so strange, so sorrowful, that those who heard it carried its weight forever. It began like mist, thin, uncertain, brushing the ears as though it might vanish at any moment. Then it deepened, gathering strength until it was unmistakable. The cry of a woman. It was not the wail of wind-bending reeds, nor the shriek of a night bird. It was human, raw, broken, eternal. A voice heavy with mourning, as though the world itself had lost something precious. An old woman who sat weaving by the canal stopped, her hands trembling against the loom. She lifted her head, eyes clouded with age, and whispered, "She walks again, the serpent woman, the mother of births." Children peered from doorways, wide-eyed, clutching each other as the sound swept through the streets. Dogs whined, their ears pressed flat. The guards tightened their grips on their spears, glancing uneasily at one another, for they all knew her name, Tzihuacoatl, the goddess who held both knife and cradle, midwife of humanity, protector of mothers, harbinger of doom. By day, the city glowed with wealth and beauty. The marketplaces overflowed with bright feathers, cacao beans, obsidian mirrors that caught the sun, and maize stacked high like gold. The people walked proud, their hair braided with shells, their cloaks embroidered in brilliant colors. Warriors carried jaguar skins on their shoulders. Priests painted their faces with ash. Dancers spun in the plazas with skirts like fire. But by night, when her cry drifted through the canals, all splendor felt fragile, like a clay pot balanced on a stone edge. "She warns us," a priest said once, lowering his head as the wail rose. "She speaks of sorrow to come." No one understood fully. Mothers held their babies closer, rocking them through the night. Fathers whispered prayers into the darkness. Even the emperor, it was said, felt a shiver when her voice touched the palace walls. For though she was a goddess, her cry was the cry of a mother, and every heart recognized it. As time passed, the signs multiplied. Birds flew in frantic, broken patterns. Fish thrashed near the surface of the lake, as though trying to escape something unseen. Children who once played fearless in the water now refused to go near it, their small bodies trembling when urged. Then came the night a man returned late from a festival, his steps unsteady from drink. He crossed a bridge over the canal, laughter still clinging faintly to his lips, when he froze. Ahead stood a woman in white, not on the bridge, but hovering just above it, her veil drifting like smoke. She pressed her hands against her chest and stared southward, where the horizon shimmered with shapes none could yet name. Ships, foreign and vast, crept closer across the distant sea. The man swore he heard her words, soft yet piercing. "Oh, my children! Oh, my children!" His knees buckled, and he fell to the stones. By dawn he spread the tale, and the city buzzed with dread. When the strangers arrived, when steel clashed against obsidian and temples burned, the people remembered her cry. They said she had warned them, that her lament was not only for her children, but for the world itself. Yet her voice did not vanish with the fall of the empire. Instead, it sank deeper into rivers, into reeds, into the hearts of those who survived. Like water, it flowed unseen, waiting to rise again. And in time, it would. Far from the city, in a village of mud walls and straw roofs, a child was born, a girl with eyes as dark as the river at midnight. The midwife, wiping her hands, whispered words none understood. "This one will walk with sorrow at her side." She grew as the village grew around her, slow, deliberate, with seasons as markers instead of clocks. At dawn, the hens fretted in their pen, and the first threads of smoke curled from the cooking fires. Her mother's hands moved in a rhythm the girl learned long before she could name it. Rinse, grind, knead, pat. Each motion a language of its own. The stone metate gleamed from use, its surface smoothed by years of maize turned into masa. And the girls sang to keep the pace, small notes rising and falling like larks over furrows. There was a path from the back of their house to the river, a narrow track through scrub and cane, where the earth held yesterday's footprints with a loyalty that borders on love. The girl walked it every morning, a clay jar balanced against her hip, bare feet finding the cool patches in the dust, eyes bright in the low slant of the sun. Water gathered in a slow bend there, green and silver and sometimes mirror black when the clouds folded over the sky. She would kneel and watch the surface until the world settled inside it. A thatch roof, a dragonfly stitching the air, a passing cloud stitched to a passing mood. On those mornings, she felt the river keep her secrets, the way mothers keep their children's first teeth. Quietly, carefully, forever, she spoke to the water, not as one speaks to a god or even a friend, but as a girl speaks to herself when no one is listening. "Do you remember me?" she would ask. "Yesterday I dropped a seed, and you carried it away." The current would ribbon through her reflection, and sometimes she imagined she heard a small answer. Sometimes she did not need to imagine at all. The reeds sighed, the stones clicked as the water kissed them, and the river made a sound like the softest consent. There were lessons, too, coaxed into her bones by the women of the village. Do not leave your shawl where wind can steal it. Do not show your teeth at men who have not earned your laughter. Do not trust a promise given in moonlight before it has survived the sun. And the ones about the river, repeated like prayer. The banks change after rain. The deep looks shallow at noon. Water is a path for those who know it, and a wall for those who don't. Her mother did not say the word Llorona. She did not need to. She taught by tightening her grip a little when the girl leaned too far, by pausing her grinding when a cry, any cry, drifted across the afternoon. Sorrow was inherited in gestures long before it had a name. The girl's father, when he was home, smelled of damp rope and nets, of the faint tang of fish that clings to skin like a memory that will not wash away. He braided twine without looking, his fingers sure, even in the low light. He loved his daughter in the way men who are often at the mercy of weather love. clumsy, earnest, with more gifts than words. He whittled a small flute from reed and taught her to call birds from the hedges. He told her which clouds meant haste and which meant shelter. When storms came, a quick fist of wind, a tantrum of rain. He timed the strikes of lightning and counted with her until the thunder answered, teaching her how to measure distance with fear and patience. There were festivals. Of course there were festivals. Even the poorest places keep calendars for joy. On the Day of Candles, children carried clay tapers shaped like turtles and birds. Tiny flames leaned in the slightest wind and made light from the air itself. The girl wore a white dress her mother had stitched from the thinnest cotton they could afford, the hem embroidered with blue thread to keep away envy. She did not have a necklace, but her aunt gave her a ribbon the color of young leaves, and it shone against her dark hair like an idea that has just been born. Vendors crowded the square, and the smell of sugar and anise winked through the evening. Musicians tuned their guitars and let notes fall like warm rain. The girl watched a dancer's skirt whirl in red and gold until her eyes ached from trying to catch each pleat. Then she laughed, full and unafraid, and the sound turned heads. Not for its boldness, but for the way it softened even old faces. Beauty had begun to latch itself to her the way ivy takes a wall. First a curl, then a pattern, then an inevitability. Mothers murmured to one another, "Blessing, yes. But keep an eye, keep an eye. Blessings can topple a house if you do not brace the beams." At the river, in quieter hours, she learned to read small things that larger eyes miss. A bubble means a turtle, not a fish. A swirl means a root below, not a rock. The green band by the far bank means the current carried extra silt last night. Someone cut a channel upstream. She could tell by the hush of late afternoon when the water would be warmer, by the fence of reeds where eels sometimes tuck themselves in dreams. And she learned the river's moods, its green-brown humbleness after a fast, its shining arrogance when the sky emptied into it, its sulking, mud-thick retreat during dry weeks. She loved each face. She loved them so completely that she began to believe the river loved her back. And yet, even loyalties make their small betrayals. Once, when she was 12, the river bit the bank away without warning and stole a corner of their yard. Her mother stood with her hands on her hips, measuring the loss with her eyes. No tears. "We have been given and we have been taken," she said simply. Then they moved the woodpile and mended the little fence. That night the girl sat awake longer than she should have, listening to the sound the river made when it decided things. It was not a cruel sound, but neither was it kind. The men told stories to each other when their wives were out of earshot and the fire was low, of a woman in white walking the high path after midnight, of a voice calling, my children," in a tone the wind could not mimic, of a shape that hovered just above the ground the way heat hovers over the road in summer. The girl heard one such story by accident. She had returned for a shawl and found herself within the boundary of their hush. She did not announce herself. She held her breath and listened as fear pried the bravest voices into careful fractions. Then she left, shawl forgotten, and walked to the river where frogs wrote punctuation on the dark. "Is it you?" she whispered. The river did not answer. A fish turned, drawing a delicate S under the skin of the world. Years slid forward, The girl's hands became more certain. Her feet learned the exact weight of her body on damp earth. Her hair grew longer than patience. Suitors practiced their best postures when she passed. Some brought baskets. Some brought jokes. Some brought promises carved out of an afternoon and offered them as if they would survive the night. She treated them all with kindness and reserve. A balance her mother had taught her without telling her the lesson. Kindness is a door. Reserve is a lock. Use both. On a spring morning, she saw a bird she had never seen. A flash of cobalt like a chip of sky fallen into leaves. It hopped along a branch as if it had borrowed that branch on credit and could not stay long. She laughed, and the bird turned its head as if to remember her face. She followed it to the bend in the river where tall cane made a green room. There, between two reeds, a thin ribbon of water moved faster, like a secret wanting to be told. She leaned over and saw her reflection moved into three selves by the current. She liked this idea, that she might be many things at once, and still only herself. The village kept wisdom stored in proverbs the way granaries keep maize, for hunger later. One, rarely spoken in front of daughters, was that men belong to roads. Another, always spoken where daughters could hear, was that water belongs to no one. She liked the second proverb better, because it felt like freedom. She would learn to dislike it later. She caught the attention of a traveling peddler one afternoon. He wore the city on him like a perfume, clean boots, a thin silver ring, a tongue that remembered to make words charming. He sold mirrors thin as dragonfly wings and combs cut from tortoise shell. The mirror startled her with its stern version of truth. It showed her a woman where the river showed her a sky full of shapes. The peddler told stories of distant markets where silk whispered like grass and sugar was sold in loaves tall as a child. She listened, and then she went home, put her hands in dough, and let the stories dissolve into the smell of yeast and wood smoke. She belonged to this place, or so she thought, or so she hoped. Her mother grew quieter that year, not unhappy, just careful, like a woman carrying a bowl to the next room without spilling. One evening, the girl asked, "What is the worst thing the river can do?" The mother did not answer at once. She tied off the end of a braid and put the comb down with the respect one gives to small weapons. "The worst?" she said finally. "It can remember for you. When it remembers for you, you stop remembering for yourself." The girl folded this sentence and tucked it into the pocket where children keep riddles they will not solve until their hearts break. There was a drought that year, not long but sharp. Dust made lace of everything. The river showed its bones, stones rounded by centuries, a rusted hook, the husk of a clay pot. In the evenings, when the low sun made the world feel like an idea borrowed from someone kinder, the girl sat on the bank and watched boys throw pebbles and count rings as they jumped. 1, 2, 3, 4, plip. She found herself listening for something more than pebbles and boys. She did not know what. In the middle of wanting and not wanting, a day will sometimes stand up and say, "I am the hinge." This was such a day. He arrived on a horse the color of thunderclouds, a fine-boned creature whose ears flicked at gnats-like disdain is a movement taught from birth. Dust rose around them in a halo, not holy, but declarative. He was dressed like the city does a man, a riding cloak that held light the way a coin holds warmth, boots that had learned to be silent, a hat with a flourish he negotiated without apology. The village heard him before it saw him, and then, when it saw him, it measured itself against him and found too many edges. He was Spanish by face and posture, by the easy entitlement with which he let his eyes rest where they pleased. Yet his Spanishness wore the place's dust like a concession. He had been here long enough to learn the patience roads demand. He went to the square, bought water without asking the price, and turned his head only when the girl crossed the far edge of his sight. The moment was small, a glance a fraction longer than polite, but in it the air rearranged itself. The village, which had always assumed it was facing inward, found itself facing outward all at once. That night the girl did not sleep quickly. She lay on her back and counted her heartbeat as if it were a soft animal she could pet and calm. Outside, the river kept its secrets. She tried to think of nothing but kept arriving in the shape of a cloak, the tilt of a hat, the unhurried way a man sits a horse when he believes the ground has been training itself for him. She was not yet in love, but a space had been cleared where love could build a house. The next afternoon, the path to the river felt shorter. She told herself it was because she had 2 jars instead of 1, and wanted to make fewer trips. In truth, time had thinned with expectation. She reached the bend with the green room of cane, knelt, filled the first jar, turned, and there he was, a polite distance away, holding his horse by the reins, hat tucked in the crook of his elbow. He did not bow deeply, but he bowed, and that from such a man felt like kneeling. "Buenas tardes," he said in Spanish, words coming smooth as river stones. Then carefully, he tried her language. Slower, respectful, like a man stepping into a house with his hat in his hands. "Good. Good afternoon." The effort charmed her. She nodded and returned the greeting, and the corner of his mouth warmed, pleased not with himself, but with the small bridge they had built between syllables. He asked about the river, where it ran in the rainy season, where it slept when it was tired. She answered. He asked about the path to the hills. She drew it in the sand with a willow twig, and did not mention the place where it narrows so suddenly you think the earth has changed its mind about letting you through. He asked whether the market had good bread. She said yes, then added, before caution could cover her mouth, that her mother's bread was better. When he laughed, it was not loud. It was the kind of laugh that tries not to scare a bird. He did not ask her name, not yet. He asked if she would mind if he watered his horse where she stood. She stepped aside and watched the animal lower its head, the slow intelligence of its muscles rippling as if thought itself were moving under the skin. She had always liked creatures that could carry their own fear without spilling it. The horse did. He was Spanish by face and posture, by the easy entitlement with which he let his eyes rest where they pleased. Yet his Spanishness wore the place's dust like a concession. He had been here long enough to learn the patience roads demand. He went to the square, bought water without asking the price, and turned his head only when the girl crossed the far edge of his sight. The moment was small, a glance a fraction longer than polite, but in it the air rearranged itself. The village, which had always assumed it was facing inward, found itself facing outward all at once. That night the girl did not sleep quickly. She lay on her back and counted her heartbeat as if it were a soft animal she could pet and calm. Outside, the river kept its secrets. She tried to think of nothing but kept arriving in the shape of a cloak, the tilt of a hat, the unhurried way a man sits a horse when he believes the ground has been training itself for him. She was not yet in love, but a space had been cleared where love could build a house. The next afternoon, the path to the river felt shorter. She told herself it was because she had 2 jars instead of 1, and wanted to make fewer trips. In truth, time had thinned with expectation. She reached the bend with the green room of cane, knelt, filled the first jar, turned, and there he was, a polite distance away, holding his horse by the reins, hat tucked in the crook of his elbow. He did not bow deeply, but he bowed, and that from such a man felt like kneeling. "Buenas tardes," he said in Spanish, words coming smooth as river stones. Then carefully, he tried her language. Slower, respectful, like a man stepping into a house with his hat in his hands. "Good. Good afternoon." The effort charmed her. She nodded and returned the greeting, and the corner of his mouth warmed, pleased not with himself, but with the small bridge they had built between syllables. He asked about the river, where it ran in the rainy season, where it slept when it was tired. She answered. He asked about the path to the hills. She drew it in the sand with a willow twig, and did not mention the place where it narrows so suddenly you think the earth has changed its mind about letting you through. He asked whether the market had good bread. She said yes, then added, before caution could cover her mouth, that her mother's bread was better. When he laughed, it was not loud. It was the kind of laugh that tries not to scare a bird. He did not ask her name, not yet. He asked if she would mind if he watered his horse where she stood. She stepped aside and watched the animal lower its head, the slow intelligence of its muscles rippling as if thought itself were moving under the skin. She had always liked creatures that could carry their own fear without spilling it. The horse did. This is how beginnings often look from the inside. Not like fire, but like a lamp turned up 1 notch past sensible. A brightness you can still pretend you don't see if you refuse to look directly at it. She looked directly at it. And somewhere in the wide world that had not yet laid its traps for her, a carriage's wheels were being greased. A ring was being polished. A letter was being written by a woman who wore silk the way some women wear certainty. But the girl did not know that. The story, for now, was only this: a path to a river, a horse that understood its hooves, a man who spoke carefully, and a girl who believed water was incapable of forgetting her. Days turned into weeks, and the river seemed to conspire with their meetings. Its banks grew familiar to both of them, a stage where reeds bent in hushed approval and dragonflies traced invisible circles above their heads. He would come astride his thunder-gray horse, cloak flowing like a banner, and she would arrive with her clay jar or her shawl pulled close, her heart racing though her steps were calm. Their words at first were cautious, careful, like stones placed across a stream to see if they would hold. He spoke of the city where the streets gleamed with stone, where merchants sold jewels and silks, where towers rose high enough to challenge the sky. She listened with wonder, yet also with a quiet pride for her own world. The maize fields golden at harvest, the laughter of children chasing fireflies, the way her mother's bread could fill a house with warmth. He admired her eyes most, telling her they carried entire constellations. He traced her fingers gently, saying they were made not only to weave, but to command fate itself. She laughed at his words, yet each laugh gave him permission to speak more boldly, and each boldness stitched another thread between them. At dusk, when the air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth, they would walk together by the river. He spoke of journeys he might take, of lands across oceans, of palaces and cathedrals, of kings whose crowns glittered brighter than fire. She told him of the old stories her mother had shared, of women who carried light in darkness, of cries that warned of sorrow. He listened, head bowed, as though these tales were treasures more precious than gold. Sometimes he brought gifts. A comb carved of tortoiseshell, polished until it gleamed like amber. A ribbon the color of a clear sky, which he tied gently in her hair. A silver coin, warm from his palm, pressed into her hand as though it were not money, but a secret. She accepted each one hesitantly, for her heart valued not the object, but the gesture, not the gift, but the gaze that accompanied it. Their love grew in shadows, hidden from the village's open eyes. They met at twilight, when the fields quieted and the river darkened, when her shawl could cover her blush and his cloak could hide his trembling hand. Words of promise slipped between them. He swore he would marry her, swore that his world would become hers, swore that their children would never know hunger, never know fear. She believed, because belief is what hearts do when faced with fire. Her mother began to notice her long silences, her late returns from the river, the flush in her cheeks when no laughter had passed. One evening, as they ground maize together, her mother said softly, "Be careful where you place your trust, my daughter. The river is deep, and so are men's hearts." The girl nodded but did not answer. For how could she explain that she had already surrendered, that her heart had already chosen its course as surely as water runs downhill? And then came the season of rain. The river swelled, furious and wide, its voice louder than drums, its edges gnawing at the land. On one such night, he came to her door, his cloak drenched, his eyes burning. She let him in, her hands trembling as she set a lamp upon the table. The storm raged outside, lightning splitting the sky, thunder rolling like war drums. Yet inside their world was small and warm, two hearts beating too fast in the same air. He kissed her for the first time that night, his lips tasting of rain, his hands shaking not from cold, but from hunger of a different kind. She felt herself melt into him, the world vanishing until there was only his breath, his voice whispering her name, his promises spilling like the storm itself. "You are mine, and I am yours. I will never leave you. You will be my wife." The storm carried their secret away, yet also sealed it. From that night, their love belonged not to the village, not even to themselves. It belonged to fate. In the months that followed, her belly began to swell. She pressed her hand to it in awe, feeling life stir within. When the child came, it was as though the world began anew. A boy, his cries sharp and strong, his tiny fists clenched as though ready to fight. She wept with joy, pressing him to her chest, whispering promises of love and safety. And when the Spaniard returned and saw his son, pride filled his face. He named the child with a Spanish name, proud to carry his blood. He swore again, with lips against her hair, that soon she would be his wife, that soon he would bring her into the world that waited for them. She believed. How could she not? But seasons turn as they always do. The promises began to thin, like mist in the morning sun. His visits grew shorter, his eyes less steady. The gifts dwindled, the words grew vague. Her heart, once blazing, began to tremble with doubt, and yet she clung to hope. For hope is the cruelest and most faithful companion of all. Not long after, her body swelled once more. The women of the village shook their heads knowingly, some with kindness, others with envy. "Two blessings in such short years," they murmured, though some muttered darker words when her back was turned. She paid them no mind. Her days were filled with the rhythm of motherhood, her nights with the hope of a love that would someday be honored before all. The second child came on a night heavy with stars, when the air seemed to hold its breath in expectation. The river ran calm, its surface reflecting the sky so perfectly that it looked like the heavens had fallen into its arms. Her pains began at dusk, sharp as the bite of obsidian, but she bore them with quiet strength, her mother by her side, her hands clenched into the woven mat. Hours passed, and then, with a cry that pierced the silence, another life entered the world. This time it was a girl, her skin soft as dawn, her voice delicate as birdsong. The baby's eyes, dark and deep, seemed all ready to hold secrets. The mother pressed her close, tears sliding down her cheeks, whispering promises of safety, love, and joy. She thought, "Now we are complete, a son and a daughter. Surely he will see that the gods themselves have blessed us." When the Spaniard arrived and saw both children, his smile spread wide. He lifted them, one in each arm, as though he were a king holding heirs to his throne. He kissed her, speaking words that burned like sunlight. "You have given me everything. Soon I will give you everything in return. My name, my home, my world." She believed him with all her soul. The seasons turned, and her house was filled with laughter. The boy toddled through the yard, chasing hens, while the girl cooed in her cradle, her small hands grasping the air. At night the mother sang lullabies, her voice soft and steady, carrying not just her children, but her own heart into sleep. She whispered prayers of gratitude to the river, to the sky, to the gods, believing her happiness was proof that love could endure. But shadows lengthen when no one is watching. The Spaniard's visits became irregular. At first, she told herself it was duty, that the city demanded his presence, that he could not always escape. Then she noticed how quickly he left after holding the children, how his eyes seemed to wander when she spoke of the future. The gifts he brought grew smaller, less thoughtful, a sweet wrapped in paper, a trinket of little worth. His laughter no longer filled the room. Her mother warned her with silence, the kind of silence that falls heavier than words. Neighbors whispered, their tones sharp with gossip. Men from the city do not marry women from the village. They take and then they leave. She covered her ears, refusing to hear. She clung to the memory of his first promises, to the heat of his kisses, to the way his eyes had once seen only her. And yet doubt grew. In the deep of night, when the children slept beside her, she stared into the shadows and wondered, what if he never came back? What if all his promises were dust? What if she and her children were nothing more than a secret hidden on the edges of his life? One morning, she woke to find a ribbon he had given her torn by time, its color faded. She held it in her hands, remembering his smile when he tied it in her hair. Tears fell onto the fabric, and she thought, can love fade as quickly as a ribbon's dye? Then came the day of the procession. The village buzzed with excitement, for a carriage was coming from the city, drawn by horses tall and proud, its wheels gilded, its windows gleaming. People gathered to watch, lining the dusty road, children perched on fences, elders leaning on their canes. She too came, her son clutching her hand, her daughter in her arms, her heart fluttering with both fear and hope. The dust rose first, then the sound of hooves. And then, there he was. The Spaniard rode at the head of the procession, his cloak flashing in the sun, his posture regal, his face proud. Her heart leapt, her lips parted to call his name. But then she saw the carriage behind him. Inside sat a woman dressed in silks brighter than any dawn, jewels glittering at her throat and wrists. She held herself with elegance, her chin lifted, her smile serene. She was his wife, his true wife, the woman he had been bound to all along. The villagers gasped, murmuring, bowing their heads in respect. The children cried, "Papa! Papa!" But he did not turn. His eyes never met theirs, never met hers. He rode past as though they were invisible, as though the years they had shared had been no more than shadows. Her world shattered. She felt the weight of every whisper, every warning, every silence. Her cheeks burned with shame, her heart with betrayal. Her children clung to her, but she could not hold them tightly enough to shield them from the truth. The man she had loved, the father of her children, had abandoned her. Not only her, but them, his own flesh and blood. That night, by the river, she wept until her body shook. The water seemed to mock her, its surface rippling with silver laughter beneath the moon. She whispered to it, her voice raw, "I was never his wife. I was never his equal. I was nothing but his shadow." And in that moment, despair crept into her soul like a rising flood, unstoppable, merciless. The night of her despair was thick with silence. The stars seemed distant, unwilling to look down upon her pain. And the moon slipped behind a veil of clouds as if it too could not bear witness. Her children slept soundly, their breaths rising and falling like soft tides, their small bodies warm against hers. She gazed at them with eyes burning from weeping, her hands trembling as she brushed their hair. She remembered the promises, words once bright as fireflies, now ashes on her tongue. She remembered his laughter, his touch, the way he had sworn she was his future. All lies. Each memory pressed against her like a blade, cutting deeper, reminding her of what she had given, what she had lost. And worst of all, the shame, the whispers of neighbors, the silence of her mother, the averted eyes of the villagers. She was not only betrayed, she was broken. The river called to her. It always had. Its voice was in the rush of reeds, in the hush of stones, in the cold breath that kissed the earth after sunset. Tonight it was louder, insistent, like a drumbeat she could not ignore. She lifted her children into her arms, one stirring, one murmuring in dreams, and stepped onto the path that led to the water. The reeds bent before her, bowing as though in mourning. The ground grew softer, damp beneath her bare feet. The current shimmered faintly in the starlight, black glass rippling with secrets. She stood at the edge, the children heavy in her arms, and the world seemed to still. She kissed her son's forehead. She pressed her cheek to her daughter's hair. Tears fell onto their skin like a baptism of sorrow. "Forgive me," she whispered, voice breaking. "Forgive me, my loves. I cannot let you live with this shame. I cannot let you suffer what I have suffered." Her body shook with sobs. For a heartbeat she hesitated. Love battled despair, memory battled grief. She saw flashes of joy, the first cry of her son, the laughter of her daughter, the feel of their tiny hands reaching for hers. For a moment, she almost turned back. But despair was stronger. With a cry that shattered the night, she stepped into the water. The river gripped her instantly, cold and merciless. The children whimpered, their small arms tightening around her neck. Her heart nearly broke anew at their trust, at the way they nestled against her, believing they were safe in her arms. She sobbed, shaking, but forced her trembling hands to press them beneath the surface. The boy struggled. The girl gasped, their eyes wide with confusion. She pressed harder, her tears blinding her, her screams torn from her throat. The water swallowed their cries, silenced their breaths, pulled them into its depths. Her voice tore free, raw and unearthly, echoing into the valley. Mis hijos! Mis hijos! The cry was so fierce that men woke in terror. Women covered their children's ears. Dogs howled into the void. The very air trembled with her grief. She clawed at the water, frantic, desperate to pull them back, to undo what she had done. But the current was merciless, dragging them away, carrying them into shadows no hand could reach. Their small faces disappeared beneath the black surface, and she was left with emptiness in her arms. She staggered back to the bank, her dress heavy, her hair plastered to her face, her hands bleeding from the sharp stones. She screamed again and again, "My children! My children!" until her voice cracked and broke, until the only sound left was the river itself. Some say she collapsed there, her body sinking into the mud, her soul torn free and carried away. Others say she fled into the night, her white figure drifting through the reeds, her cry echoing still. But all agree, after that night, the world was never silent again. The villagers found no trace of the children, only footprints at the edge of the water, and silence that felt heavier than stone. Some whispered that the river had claimed them as its own. Others said she had been cursed, condemned to wander forever in search of what she had lost. And from then on, the river was never just a river. It was a threshold, a place of sorrow, a place haunted by the cry of a mother who had destroyed what she loved most. That night, after the river swallowed her cries, the village did not sleep. Doors creaked open, lanterns flickered in the dark, and whispers moved faster than the wind. Mothers clutched their children to their breasts, rocking them even as they stirred in confusion. Fathers stood at thresholds, gripping knives and staffs, though none of them knew what they were defending against. The air was heavy, thick with the sound of weeping. Some swore it was the woman herself, running through the streets in madness, her veil trailing behind her. Others said she had vanished into the earth, her voice left behind to haunt the night. But wherever it came from, the sound was real. A cry that echoed from the hills, that shivered through the trees, that trembled upon the water's skin. Mis hijos, mis hijos. It was not only grief, it was accusation, lament, punishment. It pierced marrow, it withered courage. Those who heard it said they felt their own hearts crack open, as though her sorrow had reached inside them and claimed a part of their soul. At dawn, the villagers gathered by the river. The reeds swayed softly, the water carried its eternal current, and the footprints remained. Hers, small and bare, pressed into the mud, leading into the shallows and stopping where the water deepened. But of her children there was nothing. No body, no trace, no breath of laughter. The river had taken them completely, as if they had never been. Some whispered that the gods had punished her for her crime, binding her soul to eternal wandering. Others said the devil had claimed her, delighted by the way despair can turn love into destruction. But the mothers shook their heads, clutching their children tighter, and said only this: "She will come again, for sorrow never ends." And so she did. On the second night, a farmer returning late from his fields heard the sound. At first he thought it was the wind through the reeds, but then it sharpened, rising into words that chilled his blood. He saw her by the bend of the river, her white gown gleaming faintly, her long hair wet and tangled, her face hidden behind shadows. She raised her arms as if cradling something invisible, rocking it gently. When he stepped closer, she turned toward him, and her eyes were hollows of darkness. He fled, stumbling through the fields, and when he reached his home, he swore never to walk alone at night again. A child claimed to have seen her standing at the edge of the village well, peering into its depths, her voice echoing faintly as though searching for children she had lost. Another boy, braver than most, said he followed the sound of her weeping into the cane fields. There he saw her back, her long veil fluttering, her shoulders trembling with sobs. When he called out to her, she turned, and her face was not a woman's, but a skull, her teeth bared in eternal grief. The boy fainted, and when he woke, his hair had turned white. Every night after, the people heard her, sometimes near, sometimes far. Sometimes her cry was soft, a lullaby twisted with sorrow. Other times it rose into a scream so fierce that dogs howled and birds scattered from their roosts. Always the same words: "My children, my children." Fear became law. Mothers warned their little ones never to wander after dusk. Fathers forbade their sons from swimming in the river. Children were told, "If you disobey, La Llorona will come for you. She will mistake you for her own and drag you into the water." And the children, wide-eyed, obeyed. But warnings alone did not keep her away. Travelers vanished near the river banks. Fishermen swore they saw a woman rise from the water, her hands reaching for their boats. One man claimed he felt fingers grip his ankle as he stood in the shallows, cold and relentless, pulling him down until he screamed for help. His companions dragged him free, but when they looked, bruises ringed his leg, like the marks of hands. Soon, no one doubted she was real. She had become not only a story, but a presence, seen, heard, feared. The village lived in her shadow. The river no longer a friend, but a threshold, a place where life and death blurred. And her legend grew with every retelling. Her cry was not meant for one village alone. Grief that deep has no borders, no walls strong enough to contain it. Like water, it slipped into rivers and streams, crossed mountains, and spread across lands. Wherever there was a current, wherever children laughed by water's edge, there too the sound of La Llorona began to echo. In Guatemala, they said she haunted Lake Atitlán, a body of water so vast and blue it seemed a piece of sky had fallen to earth. Fishermen paddling their canoes swore they saw her rise from the depths, her gown trailing behind her like tangled weeds. She stretched out her arms as though to gather them, her voice trembling across the waves. "Mis hijos?" My children. Some men vanished into that lake, their boats drifting back empty, their nets torn. Families lit candles on the shore, placing them in hollow gourds that floated like tiny stars, prayers trembling on the water. Mother, do not take ours. keep searching, but pass us by. In El Salvador, her wail threaded itself through the great Lempa River. Travelers warned one another, "Do not walk its banks at night." They spoke of a woman standing in white, her face hidden by a veil, her cry pulling wanderers closer and closer until the current claimed them. A caravan once refused to camp near its waters, though the path was long and their feet bled. Better thirst than the risk of hearing that voice, they said. And yet, even far from the river, the wind carried her lament, reminding them that sorrow walks farther than footsteps. In Colombia's green jungles, her story changed again. There, hunters said they heard her lullabies in the trees, soft, sweet, almost tender, until the notes broke into sobs that froze their hearts. Sometimes children vanished from villages along the Magdalena River. Their bodies later found on the banks, eyes wide open, lips parted as though still trying to call for their mothers. The elders would shake their heads and murmur, "La Llorona mistook them for her own." To protect their little ones, parents tied charms of bone and feather above doorways, believing the smell of smoke and herbs might confuse her sorrowful spirit. Farther south, in Venezuela, the wide llanos filled with her name. Cowboys driving cattle swore that in the rains, when rivers swelled and the plains turned to sea, they heard her wail rolling across the horizon. She drifted through the mist like a figure stitched from rain, her dress whipping in the storm, her face pale lightning against the dark sky. Sometimes cattle stampeded, startled not by thunder, but by her cry. Men returned to camp trembling, swearing they had seen her standing ankle-deep in flood water, her hands reaching out as if the plains themselves were children she longed to hold. And then, across deserts and borders, she followed her people north. In New Mexico, she was seen beneath bridges, her reflection rippling in the dark water below. Teenagers, daring one another, leaned over the railings at midnight, calling her name. Sometimes nothing came but silence, but sometimes a cry rose from the depths. So soft at first they leaned closer, only to flinch when it split the night with unbearable sorrow. A few swore they saw her face, pale and glistening, staring up from the water. None lingered long enough to look twice. In Texas, along the Rio Grande, she became law as much as legend. Families taught their children never to wander near the river after dusk. Mothers warned, "She walks these waters. She will mistake you for her own. She will drag you away." And children obeyed, not because they understood, but because they had seen their mother's eyes darken when they spoke the name. Travelers on lonely highways told stories too. A trucker driving through the desert swore he saw a woman in white waving desperately at the roadside. He slowed, but when he stopped, the place was empty, the ground damp as though rain had fallen from nowhere. That night, alone in his cab, he heard weeping behind him, though no one sat in the dark seat. He drove on, sweating, until dawn freed him. Everywhere her legend flowed, it changed shape. Yet it was always her, a mother searching, weeping, calling, a voice that could not be silenced by distance, that could not be buried by time. Her sorrow had become eternal, woven into the rivers of an entire continent. And in every place, people agreed on one thing. If you heard her cry, you must not answer. For if you did, she would claim you, mistaking your voice for the children she lost, and you too would vanish into her endless grief. Her sorrow did not remain only in the mouths of storytellers. It slipped into art, into song, into the very ways people prayed and danced. For what is grief, if not a rhythm that refuses to end? In Mexico, musicians gave her voice new life. On dim nights in village plazas, a single guitar would begin, its strings trembling like water under wind. Then a voice, low, aching, carried from the belly more than the throat, would rise into the air. Ay de mi, Llorona. The words mourned not only her children, but every child ever lost, every mother left alone, every love broken by betrayal. Listeners wept quietly, some turning their faces into shawls, others letting the tears fall where everyone could see. The song was no longer just hers, it belonged to them all. Dancers took up her steps too. In certain festivals, women dressed in white veils drifted across stages, their arms opening and closing like wings of sorrow. Their feet tapped slowly, then faster, then stilled, as though pulled into silence by an invisible river. Behind them, drums rolled like distant thunder. Flutes keened like birds searching for their nests, and the people clapped in time with grief itself. To watch the dance was to feel her presence again, not as a ghost to fear, but as a mother to mourn with. Poets, too, could not resist her. They wrote of her white dress trailing through the centuries, of her tears watering the earth until even flowers leaned in sorrow. Some imagined her sitting by the river at dawn, whispering lullabies to reeds instead of children. Others painted her with words as both monster and martyr, a woman cursed not by her crime, but by her love. In every verse, she was reborn. Sometimes terrifying, sometimes tender, always unforgettable. And in churches, though priests warned against superstition, her shadow lingered. Mothers whispered prayers not to saints, but to her, begging her to spare their children. Candles burned in corners not meant for her, their wax dripping like tears. A woman might murmur, "Llorona, you know what it is to lose. Watch over me, for you understand, and though the church disapproved, faith is not a thing easily caged." For many, she was both warning and comfort. Proof that the heavens could still hear a mother's cry. Painters brushed her into murals on crumbling walls. Her figure in flowing white, her face hidden, her arms reaching. Sometimes she was painted rising from rivers, sometimes wandering city streets with a lantern in her hand, sometimes hovering over cradles as though longing to touch but never daring. Children grew up seeing her not only as a tale, but as a picture woven into the very streets they walked. Even theater embraced her. In small towns, plays were performed at dusk, where villagers reenacted her story with candlelight and song. The audience gasped when she entered, veiled and wailing, and some swore the real Llorona walked among them, drawn by the retelling. Stories have power, after all, and grief, once spoken aloud, has a way of answering back. Her cry became more than fear. It became a ritual, a reminder. Families sang her ballads at weddings and funerals alike. Musicians carried her lament across borders, weaving it into mariachi, into bolero, into lullabies that blurred the line between comfort and ache. Each note, each verse, was a thread pulling her into eternity. For La Llorona was not only a ghost, she was memory set to music. She was grief turned into dance. She was loss given shape by paint, by poetry, by prayer. She was the proof that sorrow, when shared, becomes not only bearable, but beautiful. And so, across plazas and churches, across paintings and poems, across the whispered prayers of mothers and the loud wails of trumpets, her story endured. Always weeping, always searching, yet always present. Centuries passed, Empires rose and fell, languages shifted like sand. But her cry remained. The world modernized, streets filled with lamps instead of torches, rivers bridged by iron instead of stone, yet still, when the night deepened, someone somewhere would swear they heard a woman's wail drifting across the water. Writers found her first. In books bound with new paper and ink, La Llorona reappeared, not just as a ghostly figure, but as metaphor. Authors wrote of her as the voice of the colonized, mourning children lost to conquest. Others saw her as the spirit of every woman silenced by betrayal, forced to wander with no justice. She appeared in novels, in folktale collections, in children's books that softened her tragedy into lessons about obedience and danger. Each page carried her farther, until even readers who had never seen the Rio Grande or the canals of Mexico City knew her name. Then came the stage lights and silver screens. Early plays retold her story with lanterns and painted backdrops, audiences gasping when the actress in white appeared wailing from the wings. Later, cinema embraced her. Black and white films cast her in shadows, her veil glowing faintly, her cries shaking theaters with sorrow. In the 1930s and 40s, audiences in Mexico sat with their hands pressed to their mouths as actresses in flowing gowns wandered misty riverbanks. Theaters trembled not from ghosts, but from the sobs of those who recognized her pain. As decades passed, Hollywood too began to borrow her. In horror films, she became a figure of terror. Her scream a sound that froze blood, her hands reaching from the screen to snatch children from their seats. Some critics complained. They made her too monstrous, too shallow. But even in fear, her story reached millions, embedding itself into the minds of audiences who had never before heard her lament. And somewhere, perhaps, her ghost smiled bitterly. Sorrow had always been twisted by others, had it not? Yet she was not only terror. She lived in music videos, in poems read aloud in smoky cafes, in murals spray-painted on city walls. Street artists painted her face in neon blues and reds, her tears dripping like fire, her children depicted as shadows pulling at her gown. Musicians sampled her cry, weaving it into electronic beats that pulsed in clubs late into the night. Even there, among flashing lights and laughter, her lament threaded through, reminding dancers that grief does not sleep. The internet gave her new life. On forums and chat rooms, teenagers whispered, "I heard her last night." They posted videos of rivers at midnight, the camera trembling, voices whispering, "Did you hear that?" Some were pranks, clever edits of wind and sobs. Others were harder to dismiss. A pale figure caught in the background, a wail so piercing it made microphones distort. Hashtags carried her across continents faster than rivers ever could. Children learned of her, not just at their mother's knees, but on glowing screens. Animated shorts showed her drifting through cartoon rivers. Creepy pasta tales retold her with modern twists. Her cry heard not at rivers but at freeways, her veil seen not by torchlight but headlights. Some laughed, some shivered, but all remembered. That was all she needed. And through all this, she became more than story. She became a mirror. Feminist writers called her the voice of women betrayed and silenced. Historians called her the shadow of colonial wounds, still bleeding centuries later. Psychologists spoke of her as grief personified, the eternal cry of trauma passed from one generation to the next. Musicians, painters, priests, skeptics, all found their own reflection in her weeping face. So now, in the 21st century, her cry still rises. sometimes from speakers in darkened theaters, sometimes from pages read by lamplight, sometimes from the whisper of a grandmother rocking a child at dusk. And sometimes, when the night is very quiet, when the river bends just right, when the wind remembers old sorrow, it rises not from art or memory, but from the world itself. A sound so ancient, so human, that even the most modern heart cannot help but tremble. Mis hijos, mis hijos. The words crossed not only rivers, not only borders, but centuries. They echo in headphones, in crowded streets, in empty bedrooms where someone lies awake at night, wondering if the cry they just heard was theirs or hers. And so La Llorona endures, not bound to past or future, not trapped in one country or culture, but alive in the endless present of grief. Her cry began in the reeds of a single river, but it has outlived empires, languages, and centuries. What was once the sorrow of one woman has become the sorrow of a continent, the echo of every mother who has ever lost, every heart that has ever been broken. La Llorona is not only a ghost by the riverbank. She is memory carried in music. She is grief painted on walls. She is the trembling note of a guitar at midnight, the whispered warning of a grandmother, the sudden silence when a child wanders too far. She is a reminder that love, when betrayed, can turn as wild as a flood, and that grief, once born, walks forever. Close your eyes now, and imagine the night around you. A river runs nearby, its surface dark, its current restless. The stars lean close, the wind falls still. At first, you hear nothing. Then, soft, trembling, unmistakable, her voice rises. Mis hijos, my children. It cuts through centuries, through the veil between the living and the dead, through your own heart. For in her cry is not only her loss, but yours, mine, ours. And when it fades, silence returns. Yet you are changed. Because once you have heard La Llorona, truly heard her, you cannot forget. She walks with you as she walks with all of us, reminding us that sorrow never dies. It only finds new rivers, new voices, new hearts in which to live. So tonight, if you wander near water, listen carefully. If you hear weeping, do not answer, for it may not be only the wind or the reeds or your imagination. It may be her, still searching, still calling, still bound to the earth by a love that became loss. And tell me, dear listener, what story, what legend, what voice from the past would you like to hear next? For as long as there are stories, as long as there are nights, there will always be another voice waiting to rise. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful, may your nights be gentle, and may every river you pass carry only calm.